Hello, welcome, Cabbage here. So, in a previous video, I talked about the legacy of the Ogre and Ivalice games, which has led to War of the Visions. And I'm super proud of that video. I haven't put as much effort into another video in a while, so I'll put a link to that in the notes. Unfortunately, I put up the picture of the wrong Mr. Yoshida in there, so here's the right one. It's crazy to think that the same guy did the artwork for Final Fantasy Tactics and also Nier Automata. But in this video, I wanted to talk about the story and setting of War of the Visions. Think about how it stands up to those previous Ogre and Ivalice games, and then how it could be improved in War of the Visions. I completely understand that I might be asking too much of a mobile game, but since this is the closest thing that we have to the next game in the spirit of either Ogre or Ivalice by Square Enix, and because we have the power of Square Enix behind the game, I think I'm within bounds to want improvements. But there is a good foundation, I think, and then I'll go back and forth between praising what the game has and then suggesting fixes for what's missing. And then the first thing that War of the Visions has that is good is a map. I might sound like I'm being facetious, but a big part of the reality and believability of a fantasy world can come from a map, and more reality and believability can help us care more, get more attached to the story and world. For people that have read Lord of the Rings or Game of the Thrones, how many times have you flipped to the front of the book to look at the maps to see where a character is or where a character is going? How much did it improve your experience? And then even Frodo and Bilbo in Lord of the Rings, they talk about poring over those maps for hours. And then how much less would your experience be without them? And then what's interesting is to compare those works with like Harry Potter or Terry Pratchett's Discworld, which do not have maps in the books, but are fine without them. I think the dividing line is that Harry Potter and Discworld are extremely flamboyantly fantastical, so it doesn't really matter how things work, or like the exact layout of Hogwarts, or where exactly is the continent of XXXX. While Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones are much more based in a sense of realism, so it does matter how far away it is from Hobbiton to Bree, or Winterfell to the Wall. The maps in the Ogre games in particular, but also in the Ivalice games, are super important and give us a great sense of place. They are often some of the first things we see. So with War of the Visions, which is it? Is it based more in a sense of realism, or more detached, more fantastical? My hope, since it is connected to all those old Ogre and Ivalice games, is that it will lean towards more realism, and so I really care about the maps of this game. Just as a side note, one interesting oddball example is Nausicaa of the Valley of Wind. There is a map in the front of those books, but to be honest, it's not really necessary. It's enough to know that the Totomekian Kingdom and the Shua Empire are at war, and that the Sea of Corruption lies between them. Any details beyond that don't really matter. And then well into the life of the Discworld series, maps were made of both Discworld and Ankh-Morpork, and while they're lots of fun to look at, they're not necessary to the enjoyment of the series. So there are maps in War of the Visions, and they're decent, but they could be better. We have this one that appears in cutscenes, and it shows us, different colors for different kingdoms, which is nice. But one, I want more detail, and two, I want more access to this map. And if we look at these other maps, which are always readily available in the game, here on this kind of bird's eye view, we get a sense of the shape of the continent, and then we get these words here, which are actually kind of hard to read. Kind of defeats the purpose of having a map. And so this is kind of useless. It kind of gives us an impression of a map, but it's not actually a useful map that we can refer to. But if we drill down into one of these areas, we can get a better look at a certain kingdom. We have Leonis and then Wezet available here. But these maps too, they're like impersonations of maps, not actual maps. We can see like, trees and roads and mountains. But for one thing, they're not detailed enough to really be useful. And then secondly, we have these gigantic icons to represent, the Leonis Castle, or like this passway, or this forest, or whatever. And so it almost becomes like a symbolic thing rather than a representative thing, or something that we can use for reference. You can imagine like a map of California where the entire city of San Francisco is just covered up by like a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge. Totally useless. So my ideal map in this game would be like one where we could like zoom in and out and then move around freely and then toggle off and on, you know, the colors of the kingdoms, or like these gigantic illustrations of like these castles and forests and stuff, so that we can get a better sense of like the topography of the land. Where exactly is the castle? Why is Wezet Castle like rumored to be so difficult to get to? That would really add to the realism of the story, and then I think make us care more. And then, this is really getting into the clouds, but if we could have like little like pins, like colored pins, moving around the map to represent like different groups of people, like Mont's Leonis group walking to Wezet, and then if we could have like a slider where we advance the story of the game, and then see where all of these different people are moving, I think that would make the world and then the story both easier to follow, but also more realistic, and so easier for us to get involved in. I know this would be a giant undertaking, and like, it wouldn't make any money for the company, but if they could do this, that would be amazing. Another improvement that I would like for this map, especially here with the hard quests, we have these different locations, but we tap on them, and all we get is just a list of missions that we can go to. It would be really cool if there was like a little blurb about, you know, the castle or the forest or whatever. Give us a little bit of flavor, a little history of the, maybe the area or even the continent somehow. And if you wanted to go even further, you could have, you know, townspeople that you could talk to in each of those locations. And it wouldn't have to be like a walk-around thing, like in a console Final Fantasy or in Brave Exvius. You could even just be like a screen of like a tavern, you know, like in Final Fantasy Tactics, and you just, you know, select stuff and you hear gossip or whatever. That would also really improve the feel of the world, I think. And also, just in general in this game, there are like no citizens, there are no townspeople, no regular people. Everybody's like a fighter. That's not super realistic. It doesn't give us a good, like, rounded view of the world. The game has maps. That is great. They could be better. Next, I want to talk about something that is missing from the game, and that is mythology. Every civilization, every people has a mythology. Humans have a natural tendency to want to make sense of the world around them. And before science, before philosophy, even before religion, you have mythology. The Aborigines in Australia, they have their dream time. The Japanese have a creation myth of a spear being drawn from the sea, every drop creating an island. Peoples from around the world have myths to explain why the sun rises and the rain falls. However, the peoples of the continent of Ardra in War of the Visions don't seem to have science or philosophy or mythology. There is at least one religion, the worship of the crystal, but that's not a majority of the people. The lack of mythology in War of the Visions, I think, hurts the depth of the flavor of the game. It's very strange to have humans around with no curiosity about where they came from or where the world came from, so if they could add that, that would be great. If we look at Tactics Ogre, we are introduced to the mythology right away. 4 goddesses ask us questions in the unit creation section. In Ogre Battle 64, our military school graduation ceremony takes place in a church. In Game of Thrones, almost right away, we know of the trees and what they represent and their relationship to the First Men. And then better maybe than most, maybe rivaling Lord of the Rings, is Nausicaä. We have the long-lost civilization, the catastrophic Days of Fire, the beginning of the Sea of Corruption, prophecies, religions, legendary secret tribes, lost treasures, the secret to everlasting life. My god. If you have never read Nausicaä, it is Miyazaki's greatest work. If you told me that I could only bring one epic fantasy with me to a desert island, I think it would have to be this one. And I'm not talking about the movie, I'm talking about the comics. Read the comics. But in War of the Visions, there's no mythology. There are only houses and people and the now. It's very surface. It's fun to think of War of the Visions as events preceding Brave Exvius, but there must be events preceding War of the Visions too. What are they? Gilgamesh, the crystal, and the artifacts seem to be the things most related to the history and possibly the mythology of Ardra, so I hope they expand on those aspects. Speaking of the houses, it's fun that they are there, but who cares? What are the stakes? It's like people who don't understand sports look at the different teams and logos and mascots and are like, meh. But one of the reasons sports is so interesting is all the stories and history of those teams, and its players and coaches and stadiums and rivalries. It's perfectly reasonable to be a fan of a team that is from a city you have never been to, because you might like a player, or you might like that team history or team personality or whatever. I'm a fan of the German soccer team now because I liked Kahn so much from that World Cup team from so many years ago. But in War of the Visions, all we have are team colors and logos and mascots. No history, no rivalries. Yes, we have alliances and arranged marriages and stuff, but with no context and no history, it's hard to care. This house is allied with that house, but not this one. But oh no, this one betrayed that one. It's just, these facts are not enough to make me care. To get back to sports for a second, the Yankees and Mariners, they played each other in the 1995 playoffs. That's fine. But if you knew why Ken Griffey Jr. held a grudge against the Yankees, that makes it all the more interesting. It gives it a human element. Also, in the previous Ogre and Ivalice games, politics kind of plays an important part in here. This is not so much the case in War of the Visions so far. That might be tricky to do in a mobile game where they're trying to attract as many people as possible. As it is now, though, the public just does not exist, and it's kind of a childish way to present politics and a kingdom. It's like a Disney princess movie. Also, at the end of the Game of Thrones TV show, it was bizarre for a bunch of reasons, but after Daenerys torches King Landing, we never see the people ever again. At the end of the series, the small council convenes again, but there are 0 shots of the city, so it just feels like, you know, these important people meeting to decide the fate of nobody, to rule nobody. It's a really bizarre feeling. And then also at the end, the 3 Stark children, you know, they meet. Sansa and Jon are leaders, but we don't see their followers at all at the end. So again, it feels weird and hollow. And finally, and maybe most importantly, War of the Visions is missing a threat and a goal, or at least obvious ones to us. In something like Lord of the Rings, the threat and goal are very clear and related. The threat is Sauron, the goal is to throw the ring into the fire to destroy Sauron. In something like Game of Thrones, they could be like separate, or like 2 threats, a clear threat and a hidden threat. The hidden threat is the White Walkers, and so like that's the true threat. But few people know about them, so the goal for most is the Iron Throne. In this case, the threat is hidden, but only to the characters, while the reader is fully aware of the threat to the White Walkers. In War of the Visions, the viewer, the player, is not aware. Like, what's the main threat in War of the Visions? Is it Gilgamesh, Muraga, Randall? We don't know. What's the main goal? Collect the ancient relics, defeat the Crystal Church, protect the crystal? We don't know. We have lots of personal goals. Edide wants to continue his line, Stern wants to kill his dad, Mont wants to become a man, or I don't know what. That's fine, but since this is not a character study, but an epic fantasy adventure with a cast of 100 characters, we need some kind of tentpole storyline to support the whole thing. So where both the main conflict and destination are unknown, we really don't have a story, we just have a bunch of characters walking around and talking to each other. This is not The Sims, this is a fantasy epic, so we need a threat and a goal. To go back to the sports analogy, it's like we have all of these teams, but there's no World Series, and it's just all a bunch of exhibition games. Alright, so those are my thoughts on War of the Visions, the story and the setting. I think it has a good bone structure, but it needs more muscle and nerves. Alright, little different video from usual, but thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Take care.